It is one of the ironies of art history that tapestries made by a community of women artists in South Africa entered public collections in Sweden before they did in their home country. Records show that in 1965 alone, 62 figurative tapestries woven by marginalized Black women at the renowned Evangelical Lutheran Church Art and Craft Center Rorke were shipped out of the apartheid state for sale to Swedish museums, schools, churches, halls, offices, and private collections. Few of these works were ever seen by South African audiences. By late 1965, various exhibitions of the center's tapestries had been hosted at public galleries in Sweden. One was Vävt in Natal, or Woven in Natal, which opened to the public at Rorke Museum of Design and Craft in Göteborg on 5 March, then at Konstfack in Stockholm in April, and at the Teachers Training College in Malmö in September. Two of these tapestries, Line 1, apparently by Lyness Magwaza and Regina Buthelezi, and Elephant Forest by an unknown weaver, were acquired for Rorke's permanent collection. Critics of the day lauded Woven in Natal as evidence of Sweden's prowess in the fields of art, craft, and philanthropy. Kurt Ekholm, for example, declared it, quote, an honor for our country to have contributed to the solution of one of our century's major human problems, the liberation of the individual, unquote. Despite these triumphant claims, scant information on the women artists from Rorke and their works would survive this milieu. Their names and the meanings they might have intended in their iconographies are now largely obscure in Sweden. More than 5 decades after this exhibition, the 2 tapestries acquired by Rorke are on show once again, alongside other migrant objects from its permanent collection. The title of the present exhibition, Migration, the Journey of Objects, aptly describes the vicissitudes of these works. Together with an accompanying publication, it highlights the paths traveled by things before they enter a museum collection and their status once accessioned into it. The 2 very different exhibitions raised various questions, not least of which is how these tapestries left South Africa for Sweden in such quantities, and why so many have since languished unremarked in storerooms or unidentified on walls. In what ways, one might ask, can we consider these tapestries, many of which now cannot be accounted for, as not merely migrated, but stranded objects? In addressing such questions, I shape a rereading of Woven in Natal that uncovers the intersecting social prejudices born of apartheid and Swedish discourses of custodianship around weavings from South African looms. As I also show, shifting political views in the Nordic country would affect the visibility of this genre of women's art in the years that followed. The plan to initiate an art craft venture at Rorke was originally evolved by a committee of Swedish philanthropists who in 1961 resolved to develop an income generation project for destitute women in a remote area of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. They also felt it incumbent on them to revive what they feared were vanishing art craft traditions here in the face of industrialization. To this end, they sent 2 young art graduates, Ulrik and Peder Gavinius, to the apartheid state under the aegis of the Church of Sweden mission. After initial weaving experiments at a rural Swedish hospital and at a Lutheran church center, in 1963, the couple signed up around 10 local women as their first trainees at the Swedish mission at Rorke, whose tapestries would support other enterprises at the center. By the mid-1960s, the operation comprised over 70 local employees, producing more than 350 woven articles per year. While Ulugavinis handled most of the weaving training, her husband took on artistic mentoring, production, and administration. However, they soon dismissed the notion of reinventing old cultural traditions as playing into the agendas of apartheid policy, which was aimed at tribalization of Africans. Instead, they urged a free weaving approach in which the image was developed directly on the loom, thus investing the work with subjectivity and immediacy. Their evolving pedagogy included group storytelling and critique, often when a tapestry was cut off the loom on completion. In order to appeal to the all-important Swedish market, every design had to be unique, including non-figurative works. Despite the enthusiasm these tapestries ignited in Sweden, few of the identities of the artists or meanings they might have intended in their iconographies were sought by collectors. Or, if they were, little of this knowledge has survived. It was enough for the committee, apparently, that these tapestries were ekta, or genuine, articles, as the media so assiduously assured readers. In acquiring Line 1 and Elephant Forest for Rorke's own collection, curators of the day sought little information on them, other than the titles and sale amount of 1,500 krona each. Once in a museum space, these works were invariably categorized, not by names, but in terms of their origins and type. Rorke's drift tapestry, for example. Typically, there was little cognizance taken of the subjectivities that might have informed their manufacture and subsequent vicissitudes. Neither did the literature woven in Natal inspired in 1965 provide much insight into the social context in which the tapestry artists worked, either singly or in small interactive alliances of 2 or 3 women at a loom. Instead, discussion of their iconographies tended to reflect the disposition of the writers themselves. Margit Strömestedt, for example, explained Line 1 as a route to the emotive self that Africa could provide. Quote, and suddenly one stood there, completely conquered by a line in the desert under a blazing orange sun. This line held us captive, unquote. In our discussions in 2015, Magwaza recalled weaving Line 1 together with Buthelezi, improvising the design from a small sketch by a third woman. Although she cannot clearly remember what it was meant to convey, she associates its imagery with an Old Testament story in Exodus 3:1-6, in which God appears in the form of a burning bush and directs Moses to liberate the Israelites from serfdom in Egypt. Magwaza ventures that the image was probably meant to represent the line of the tribe of Judah, as Jesus is triumphantly described in Revelations 5:5. In my own response to the work, the blaze of the burning bush seems reflected in the eye of the lion, perhaps suggesting a connection between these 2 miraculous events situated in the Old and New Testaments. The motif of repeat triangles that weavers sometimes used at the edges of a tapestry to stabilize the tension of the strands across the work also act as part of the landscape here, integrating with the informal chevrons that make up the hilly terrain. It might have been expected that the weft strands would be uniformly horizontal, but here they disruptively shift direction, accommodating the contours of the line's shape, perhaps suggesting waves of energy emanating from it. If Line 1 was an emancipatory response to apartheid oppression couched as a Bible story, This would not have been unusual at Rorke in the 1960s. In my discussions with the oldest generation of weavers, they remarked that, more than any of their subsequent colleagues, they were courageous enough to tackle iconographies with political inference. In our interviews, they remembered a number of obliquely subversive works, such as Mary Shabalala's Black Christ. She recalls that the figure on the cross in this only known image of the work was woven in a deep brown to appear more conclusively black. Imbued with racial specificity, this figure may well rank as the earliest visual representation of a Black Messiah by a South African women artist. There may, of course, have been other knowledges informing line 1, reminiscent perhaps of tapestries of other woven predators. One was The Hungry Line by Elizabeth Ndluli and Rose Draba, seemingly an adaptation of a well-known inherited story customarily recounted by senior women in isiZulu-speaking families. It tells of a voracious predator that devours people, animals, and whole villages to satisfy its greed, and of their subsequent rescue. In their own version of this well-known theme, the women furnished it with local relevance. A lion of gross proportions, a signifier of apartheid, gobbles up the local cattle spectre, a Mr. van der Waal. However, his flesh is so putrid that the lion vomits him up again, along with all the people, houses, and animals it had swallowed, thus saving their lives. Another oppressive predator on Woven in Natal appeared in The Blue Trees, a large collaborative work destined to hang at Rorke's big hall as an exhibition centerpiece. It evolved from a discussion one morning between 9 weavers and their teacher, in which each shared what she would like to have been, if not a human. Poignantly, Lillian Mitsali's response was, "I wish I was a bird. If I were a bird, I would always have food and never have to be hungry." Based on this concept, the women developed a painting in bold brushstrokes, then gave it to 3 others, Mrs. Lutuli, Ivy Gumba, and Bettina Zekrubu, to develop on the loom. However, as the story goes, they insinuated a menacing predator into the design, explained as the owner of all the birds. Its attention is directed at a bird in a circle of white, possibly representing Mitsali herself. Even though the tapestry was well publicized when it showed at Rorke, memories of it have since faded. When I saw it in 2016, I was told that it was a product of Haranea, a children's weaving center near Cairo in Egypt. Infantilizing associations of the women at Rorke with Haranea's child weavers are not new. Rorke's former curator, Jan Brunius, for example, took it as fact that the tapestry practice at Rorke had been cued by these children's works, representing Woven in Natal as a Swedish response to Haranea. More ill-fated was a companion piece to The Blue Trees, Black Cattle, a large topographical view of a Zulu homestead made by weavers who are now unknown. It was published with some fanfare in an article Afrikaanse Weefnade in Jüterbeursposten on 6 March that year. Brought together with The Blue Trees, it is said to have since developed mold and been incinerated as a consequence. The flow of tapestries from Africa to Sweden seemed set to become even larger. On 6 March 1965, just as the exhibition opened at Rorke, it was reported in Sweden's largest daily that, as a result of the success of Rorke, the Swedish state was considering offering conscientious objectors to military service the option of working in an art craft capacity in so-called developing countries. Although the scheme did not come to fruition, the Swedish Agency for International Assistance, or SIDA as it's now known, would buy a series of large tapestries from the centre as a way of channeling funds to it. Yet very little of the knowledge the women might have shared in the loom appears to have entered the historical record in Sweden. A compounding factor here is the erasure inherent in the representation of these works from Africa. As the tapestries were disconnected from their backstories, the organizers and the media were inclined to involve them instead in exoticizing practices. For example, the committee arranged for 4 women from Rorke to sing and tell stories at the exhibition, an exercise undoubtedly not asked of exhibiting Swedish artists. Inevitably, public support for the project would not last. In 1970, the intervention would be interrogated, not just because of the implications of its location in apartheid South Africa, but also for the asymmetries of power inherent in a rich nation developing the culture of a vulnerable African community. After the departure of the last Swedish art teachers at the center in 1976, the large legacy of tapestries in Sweden would drift into obscurity. It is clear that the stranding of these maroon tapestries was ordained in the very planning of the project, which was predicated on exportation of works to the Swedish market, at least until 1967. To the instigators, the significance of the venture lay not in the advancement of the profiles of independent artists, but in the prospect of a community's economic survival, resilience, and self-actualization in the face of crushing oppression. Due to an entanglement of economic, political, and curatorial practices then, when the tapestries were removed from the looms, they were also cut adrift from the context that informed and explained them.